Can everyone hear me? In the back? Okay. What does the Holocaust say about you? And about me also, about us, about human beings, about our nature. What does it say about our capacity for moral progress? Can we, in moral terms, become something higher and better than we are today? Can human beings learn to treat themselves more fairly, more justly, more kindly? So this is what is at issue, what is at stake in our conversation here tonight. The moral progress of humankind and what the Holocaust tells us, and equally important, does not tell us about our chances for making this kind of progress. I'm going to talk first for 26 minutes to give you my answer to the question that I think all of you have. Why did the Holocaust happen? Then I'll take 6 minutes to address the question, could this happen again? And I don't mean, could genocide happen again somewhere on Earth? Because as you know, it has. But that's not the question you're asking. That's not what people want to know. What we want to know is, could this happen here, or in Germany, or in any other established democracy? So that is the second question I want to address. And finally, I want to take 12 minutes at the end of my initial presentation to try to specify the source of the pessimism that the Holocaust inspires, it seems to me, in everyone who encounters it. The Holocaust is not like every other historical event, or should I say, it's unlike every other. We don't react to it the same way. We look at all the cruelty that human beings have visited upon one another down through recorded history, and we say, how sad. We look at the Holocaust, we're frightened. The Holocaust frightens people. But why? What is different about it? Then I'm going to pause, and I'm going to open the floor to questions from you. We'll have, I guess, about 35 minutes for questions. Then I'll take 7 minutes at the end to tie everything together and present you my principal conclusions. So let's turn first to the question, why did the Holocaust happen? I'm going to abbreviate this section because Dr. Shelton has so ably introduced me that she's actually done a lot of my job for me, and that's not a complaint. It's actually very helpful, so you don't have to listen to me go on too long. But as she indicated, you know, I've been thinking about this question why for 4 decades now, and it goes back to reading The Murderers Among Us by Simon Wiesenthal, who was a survivor of the Holocaust, who made his post-war career tracking down some of the leading perpetrators and bringing them to justice. And this book had such a powerful impact upon me that it left me with the question that has stayed with me ever since and that has become the title of my book. How could this happen? And the title's no accident. And the reactions I've gotten from so many people since the book came out confirmed the wisdom of using this title. So many people have said to me, I can't tell you how many, yes, that's exactly the question. That's the way I ask it. That's what I wonder. And this is another kind of sign of how different the Holocaust is from other historical events. We look at the Protestant Reformation, the French Revolution, the American Civil War. We say, how interesting, why did that happen? That's not the question we ask about the Holocaust. About the Holocaust, we ask, how could this have been possible? It expresses our bafflement and our horror and our fear, the question that I'm going to return to later on. As Dr. Shelton explained, the desire for an answer to this question led me through the study of the German language, into German history, into my work as a professor, including 4 very happy years here at Eastern. And throughout all my long engagement with the Holocaust, you know, I kept reading everything that I could about causes of the Holocaust, and by the end of the 1990s, I had a realization that the historical profession had already answered this question for me. That there was, in some sense, no mystery. The problem was the answer that we've been given has been useless to us because it has existed only in fragments. That is to say that academic historians like me have uncovered each of the several causes of the Holocaust, but we've done so by and large in specialized studies, each covering this or that causal factor in isolation from the others. And so we have books on anti-Semitism, books on racism, books on Adolf Hitler, books on psychological factors, books on World War I, books on 19th century German politics, and so on, and so on, and so on, and so on. And no book has brought all these fragments, these pieces of the puzzle, together in a coherent whole. And if you are not an academically trained historian, that is to say, if you are normal, okay, you have no idea where to begin. You don't even know what the fragments are, much less how to put them together. And even if you are a professional historian, it's not immediately obvious how all these pieces fit together. So that's what my book does. It brings together all the major causes of the Holocaust in a coherent, very concise, and also very accessible, readable answer to this question: how could this happen? One interesting sort of side question I just want to mention is why wasn't this done a long time ago? Because already by the early 1990s, all the research was in place to support this kind of overarching synthesis that my book provides. Yet somehow historians have hesitated. I do not propose to say why. I can only speak for myself. I was intimidated. Intimidated because I feared the Holocaust, intimidated by the sheer number and complexity of the many causes of this event, intimidated by how important the question was. Who am I to take on such a big question? In the end, it was a sort of guidance and inspiration from my girlfriend at the time that kind of got me to my desk and got me started writing, who said to me, "You need to get off your lazy behind and publish something." And so, sort of with the benefit of this sort of nurturing emotional support, I started writing what I thought was going to be a 40-page article for a scholarly journal, sort of pulling together for fellow academics kind of some thoughts on why this had happened. And when I got to my computer, the pent-up thinking of 4 decades came pouring out in a torrent. Within 3 weeks, I had 80 pages of draft. I was a third of the way to a book manuscript, and at that point, and only then, could I dare imagine writing a book that would tackle this important question. So, all that being said now, how could this happen? Well, the Holocaust could happen in the first place because the pressure within Germany from the German people to make that country a democracy as opposed to hereditary monarchy, which it was, from the 1880s on, this pressure came almost entirely from one political party. And this party was the Socialist Party. And this is a very big problem, because what it meant was that in the minds of most Germans, democracy is tainted by association with socialism. And socialism is something that most Germans very much do not want, especially because the German Socialist Party, in this period, I'm talking from 1890 to the end of World War I in 1918, the German Socialist Party, in its stated program, is very radical. They are calling for an end to private property. They're calling for an end to the capitalist system. They are calling for revolution. So you already have the idea of democracy among Germans with 2 black marks against it before Germany has even become a democracy. And the second problem that reinforces this first problem, the taint, the association of socialism and democracy, is the fact that democracy comes so late to German soil. The first German democracy, which, as you know, was called the Weimar Republic, was not established until 1919, decades after democracy came to England and France, nearly a century after this country became a democracy, or at least a democracy for white men, which was about as democratic as you could get in the 1830s. These 2 problems, they work together to have similar consequences. The linkage of socialism and democracy and the late arrival of democracy to German soil meant that, among other things, that this new republic, this new democratic system, had to operate with voters who didn't accept that the republic had a right to govern, and who often voted for extremist political parties that rejected democracy. And this made governance during the 1920s very difficult. A second problem is that because the Republic is founded so late in time, in 1919, it is also founded very close in time to the Great Depression, which began in 1929. And this is so crucial because every new form of government, and especially one that is established in a revolution the way that the Weimar Republic was, it needs a breathing space, a period of stability and good government and relative economic prosperity in which to win over voters who are skeptical about it, to establish its legitimacy among the people that it governs, to establish an acceptance of this form of government among its citizens. The Weimar Republic never got a breathing space. The first 5 years, 1919 to 1924, the whole country is just racked by political murder, leftist uprisings, right-wing counter-reprisals, the hyperinflation of 1923, and so on, basically working out the consequences of all the terrible damage that the First World War did to German society. So they only have 5 years, more or less good years, 1924 to 1929, and then the Great Depression hits, the greatest economic catastrophe of modern times, a level of economic suffering that is unprecedented, that no one has even ever heard of, much experienced. And the end game comes on the 6th of November of 1932, only 2 days before we elected Franklin Delano Roosevelt, our president. The last free elections in Germany. The voters are skeptical at best about democracy, at worst hostile. Unemployment stands at 30%. Business failures are at an all-time high. People are terrified. They are desperate. It should not surprise us that more than a half of the German voters gave their ballots to extremist political parties that rejected democracy, that were violently authoritarian. On the left, the communists; on the right, the Nazis. And this is not the whole story, but the larger part of the story of how a man like Adolf Hitler could come to power in what is arguably the most advanced human society at that time. And it's something that we have to remark on how remarkable that is because Hitler was so violent in his actions and in his thoughts and in his speech, and because he was a thoroughgoing mediocrity. Hitler really had only one thing going for him, and that was his talent for public speaking. So that such a man could come to power in such a sophisticated society is something that is very difficult to explain. Well, these, I think, are the main reasons why. What I've told you so far really takes us a long way to understanding why the first German democracy collapsed in 1932. The Depression creates this crisis. The voters don't really accept the democratic form of government. So Germany in 1932 is ripe for dictatorship. But that doesn't answer the question, why this dictator? Why Hitler? And why was Hitler and his movement so ferociously anti-Semitic? And to answer the second set of questions, we need to turn again to this very rapid and very frightening rise of the German Socialist Party. What happened was the elite of German society, what we would call the ruling class, together with the imperial government, that is the government of the Kaiser that you've heard of, they pursued a strategy of trying to contain socialism by promoting anti-Semitism and promoting a really aggressive nationalism, a kind of hyper-patriotism. And here's the logic of it. You have to explain why that works, because the relationship between socialism and anti-Semitism isn't immediately obvious. But the way it worked for the conservatives who are trying to combat socialism was that they tried to get Germans to overlook their class differences, to overlook, upper class versus middle class versus working class, and to emphasize what they supposedly all had in common, which was their German blood, which was now defined in part by just declaring that Jewish Germans, which is really what they were Germans who just happened to be practitioners of the Jewish faith, that Jewish Germans were un-German because they belonged to a separate race. And this is one point where the idea that the Jews were a race, which proved fatal in the Holocaust, sort of got established in German political discourse. To put it another way, this political strategy is one of saying, let's not think of ourselves as upper class, and let's not think of ourselves as middle class, and for heaven's sake, let us not think of ourselves as working class, and vote for these terrible socialists with their Marxist idea of class against class, of class struggle. Let us just all be German. And one way for us all to be German and to underscore our Germanness was to unite against our enemies. And so these people in the German government, they paint foreign powers like England and France and Russia as relentlessly hostile to Germany, which in fact they're not really. And at home, German Jews are the enemy. And the Jews are blamed for exactly these divisions in German society. The Jews are trying to conquer us by dividing us against each other. And if it weren't for the Jews in Germany, all we Germans would be getting along and we'd be one big happy family. That's kind of the fantasy that they're pushing. And central to this strategy was the claim that the Jews were the creators of Marxism, Marxism being the intellectual parent of socialism and of communism, and that the Jews were responsible for the rise of socialist parties and that they controlled socialist parties in Germany and elsewhere. And later, after the Russian Revolution of 1917, when Marxism is radicalized by these more violent communist parties, anti-Semitism is ratcheted up many notches higher and more violent because the Jews are also blamed for the communist threat, which to so many people is very frightening. And I can't emphasize enough the importance of this. There were, in Europe, in the first 4 decades of the 19th century, there were many different kinds of anti-Semitism. There was anti-Semitism as a religious prejudice, including this silly idea that the Jews were the killers of Christ, which people took very seriously at that time, or hostility to Jews as economic competitors, or anti-Semitism as a social prejudice. But this particular strand of anti-Semitism, the equation of Jews and Marxism, this is the strand of anti-Semitism that led directly and explicitly to the Holocaust. This is one of the main things that Hitler and his accomplices were talking about as they were carrying out the genocide and justifying their actions. Stepping back, from all of this, what I want to say summing up is that this right-wing political strategy of trying to use anti-Semitism and nationalism to contain socialism basically produces Nazism, because Nazism is just a more radical version of this right-wing political strategy that is unfolding from about 1890 to 1918. And this is also almost certainly where Adolf Hitler got his ideas about the Jewish people and his ideas about many other things as well. So, taking stock of the argument so far, what I've told you so far in a way kind of takes you from 1890 to 1933. The Weimar Republic has failed. The Nazis are in power. We know where Nazism comes from. We know how they could get into office. But these factors I've discussed with you so far, they don't add up to genocide. They explain the kind of discrimination that German Jews suffered in the 1930s. They do not explain murder. And so to understand how they made the leap, from persecution in 1933 to full-blown genocide in 1931, we need reference to 3 additional factors, radicalizing factors. The first is that at that day and age, racism was not seen the way we talk about it today as sort of the prejudice of losers, of uneducated people. Racism back in that day was seen as hard science. Educated people throughout the world, including very much in our country, thought that it was hard science that each ethnic group, each nationality, whether it's Jews or Germans or Poles or Ukrainians, what have you, is its own race. And what it meant to be a race was to have its own genetic profile, its own genetically determined characteristics, its own intelligence level, its own moral qualities. And you could, and they did, rank all of the so-called races of the world from highest to lowest in value, which also opened up the door to the idea that there were some races that were without value altogether. And this made it possible to say, okay, these Jews are the creators of communism, and not only it's not something that we can make them stop doing because it comes from their genetic nature. They're just genetically hardwired to be destructive. and it made it possible to define the Jewish people as a kind of separate species and thus to rob them of their humanity, which made it a lot easier to murder them. This dehumanization of the Jewish people through biological racism got a further, was further worsened by the impact of the First World War. The slaughter of 10 million young men in this fighting that was so pointless devalued all human life. It set a precedent for terrible violence. All the violence of the later 20th century in Europe is not imaginable without the precedent set by the loss of so many lives in this first war in this terrible way. And the third factor is the way that the German people deified Adolf Hitler. You've heard that Hitler was popular, but popular is not an adequate word. Millions of Germans, they worshipped Adolf Hitler. They thought he was a world historical figure, a genius shaping history, a man whose abilities were at a minimum superhuman, and in the eyes of many Germans, supernatural, which is also what Hitler believed about himself. And this is very destructive, first of all, because this belief in Hitler's magical qualities led many of his sort of men who were already dedicated Nazis. It gave them a loyalty to him that was so fanatical that they would happily do absolutely anything he wished. And among a much wider universe of Germans, including many people who were not Nazis, it seems safe for us to assume, although I can't tell you that we can document this thoroughly because by its nature it's not the kind of thing that leaves a trace in the documentary records, but there's good reason for thinking that basically among many other Germans who were not Nazis, the belief in Hitler's magical qualities neutralized opposition they might have felt or registered to the treatment of the Jewish people, they could have said to themselves, in effect, I'm not sure how I feel about what is being done to my Jewish neighbors, but the Fuhrer has knowledge that I don't have, and he understands things in a way that ordinary mortals like myself cannot understand. And in any case, he is all-powerful, and he has the responsibility, which relieves me of responsibility, and therefore I'm not going to worry further about it. You know, we look at newsreels. You've seen the footage at some point of the cheering crowds, just ecstatic, cheering Hitler, raving, and all of them, thousands of people sometimes, with their right hand in the Nazi salute. And you say to yourself, what is wrong with these people? I mean, did an entire country go insane? How is this possible that this mediocre, violent, hateful man becomes an object of so much adoration and worship? Well, it turns out this is actually one aspect of the story that's really, the answer is really, really simple. It's really, really easy to explain. And the answer is that Adolf Hitler was astonishingly successful. And I'll just, you know, when he came to power in January of 1933, Germany's really on the ropes. I mean, the unemployment is at 30%. The government has been paralyzed for 2.5 years. And even more, you know, they've been through 2 sets of failed governments. The empire collapses in the end of World War I in 1918. Everyone knows there's no going back to the Kaiser and the empire. Most Germans never really accepted the republic that followed, and now in the Great Depression, the republic seems totally to have failed. It's paralyzed. For a lot of Germans at that point, it's really unclear if there's any form of government that's going to allow them to govern themselves. I mean, Hitler, in this sense, stepped into a political and constitutional vacuum in January 30th of 1933, and yet within a few short years, he had these tremendous successes, and he seemed to have solved all of their problems. And I'll give you 2 examples, the 2 successes of Adolf Hitler's that were most important to the German people. First, you know, he comes to office in January of 33. Unemployment is 30%. 4 years later, Germany has returned to full employment. In some months, they've got a labor shortage. Meanwhile, in our country, we did not climb out of double-digit unemployment until 1941, when war production kicked us out of the Depression. Germany was the only major industrial economy to escape the Great Depression in the 1930s. And the second, the spring of 1940, German forces invade Western Europe. They conquer France. They drive the English armies clear off the continent with their tails between their legs at Dunkirk. They do this in only 6 weeks of fighting, and they lose only 30,000 German soldiers killed. Now you compare this, as every German had to have compared this, to the German experience in the First World War. In the First World War, the Germans, they fought the same enemies for 4 years. They lost not 30,000, but rather 2 million of their young men, and they lost the war. And so measured against that yardstick, which was the relevant yardstick, I submit to you that any people, not just Germans, would, seeing Hitler's successes in the spring of 1940, and regarded him as a miracle worker. You know, ironically, as I've already said, as I tried to make clear, Hitler was a man of mediocre talents. His successes were due far more to dumb luck than to any talent in his part, but at the time no one had any way of seeing that. It is, if I can just make sort of a parenthetical sort of side observation, this is a really classic example of how important happenstance and luck can be in history. We always assume that everything happens for a reason. This is one case where it didn't. There was no good reason why Hitler had to be so successful. But for him, in the sense of getting what he wanted, he had a run of luck that began in the early 20s and did not stop until the German armies were turned back at the gates of Moscow in December of 1941. And by then, these people had come to admire him so fervently that it was far too late to turn back from the course on which he had set them. So I want to review now what we've learned about why the Holocaust happened. Starting in 1890 or thereabouts, the Socialist Party, with this radical program, takes off dramatically. The ruling class of Germany tries to use anti-Semitism and sort of extreme nationalism to contain socialism. This essentially is the political strategy which produces Nazism and Adolf Hitler. This movement and this leader are able to get into power because German democracy collapses at the beginning of the 1930s because the voters do not really embrace democracy and because the Depression renders them absolutely desperate and irresponsible in the face of 30% unemployment. This brings us to 1933. Adolf Hitler's in power, and the persecution of German Jews has begun, but we're still a ways away from 1941 when the Holocaust truly begins. And there, what gets the Germans there is that biological racism dehumanizes the Jewish people. World War I has deprived all human life of its value and set a precedent for terrible violence, and Adolf Hitler's run of just his dumb luck gets him successes so powerful, so impressive, so spectacular, that his people would do anything he wants. And the Holocaust happened for about a half a dozen other reasons as well. But one of the things that's been so fascinating in writing this book is to try to find some way to gain control of all this complexity and to present it to my readers in such a way that nonetheless, when you're done reading it, all the pieces fall into place and it's actually pretty simple to understand, which I think actually in the end it is. But in any case, what I presented to you is the core of my book's argument. I want to return now to the main question that we're talking about tonight, which is the question, what does all this say about us? What does it say about our nature and our capacity for progress? Because it's a pretty terrible story. The point I guess I want to make, the main point I'm trying to make about this whole explanation that I've been giving you about the causes of the Holocaust is to emphasize how complex this was and that it was not easy. It did not happen easily. For this horrific event to happen in the most advanced human society, it was not enough for one thing to go wrong, or two or three or a half dozen even. By my count, the Holocaust had about a dozen causes, and of almost every one of these different causal factors, on almost every case, you could point to this cause or that cause or that cause or that cause and say, if only this piece had been missing, if only that had not happened, the rest of it, then the Holocaust would not have occurred. We wouldn't have to be here talking about it. Without the person of Adolf Hitler, who he was and the fact that he survived the First World War, everyone agrees it would be impossible to have had the Holocaust. Or just Hitler's run of luck that got him into power and gave him the successes that made him a demigod in the eyes of his people. Without that, no Holocaust. Without biological racism, so much of the violence that the Nazi regime directed not only against Jews but against so many other classes of human beings is hard to imagine. Without the terrible precedent set by the First World War, without the way that that cheapened human life, this level of violence against civilians, I mean, in 1914, before World War I, the idea that a government could slaughter, could murder in cold blood 6 million defenseless civilians, this would have been simply unimaginable. After World War I, with the death of 10 million on the battlefield, this was imaginable. All of these factors were necessary. And so I think it is very important, the Holocaust does have lessons for us about human nature. We do learn things about ourselves from studying it, but there also are some very definite limits to what it says about us, because we have to think of this as, to some degree, a perfect storm, a freak occurrence. We know it was possible because it happened, but it was, I would say, about as improbable as any historical event can be, and nonetheless still occur. So that is kind of the first piece of my argument. I mean, there's sort of three parts to my argument tonight, and the first is simply to say, yes, the Holocaust does have lessons for understanding us, but let us not be quick. Let us not too swiftly draw sweeping and negative conclusions about who we are from this event that is really truly exceptional and to some degree freakish. That's kind of the first part of my argument. I now, for the next 6 minutes, want to tackle this big question of Holocaust in progress from a second angle. I just want to return to this question: could this happen again? That is to say, in one of the world's established democracies. And to that question, I say to you, no, it absolutely could not. And I say this with complete confidence, and I'll give you 3 reasons why. First, democracies do not commit genocide. It is dictatorships that commit genocide. Yes, you look at our history, you can find that in earlier decades, in parts of the country, you could get an electoral majority, a majority of voters, to support cruel discrimination, such as what we did to African Americans, especially in the South. But can you really imagine, a majority of voters in the United States today saying, yeah, we don't like this group, let's set up gas chambers and murder them all? It's just sheerly unimaginable. Also, our very concept of democracy today is different from what it was everywhere in the world 50 years ago. In our country and in many others, democracy today includes a very robust defense for the rights of individuals and the rights of minority groups of different types. And you look at the progress that has been made in our society in the last 50 years in the rights of African Americans, in the rights of other ethnic minorities, the rights of women, the rights of gays and lesbians, the rights of disabled people. This protection, this consciousness, awareness of the rights, and the desire to protect the rights of minorities is a very powerful barrier, an insuperable barrier, I would argue, to genocide. A second reason why I say that I do not see this as possible, it's a huge change over the last 70, 80 years, that racism and anti-Semitism have lost their intellectual respectability. It used to be you could talk about, and you did in the 1930s, at universities about the racial superiority of this or that group. And of course, anti-Semitism, that was a perfectly acceptable prejudice that one uttered in public without any fear of repercussions. Today, there is, of course, still plenty of racism in this country, and a lot of anti-Semitism. There was actually a very disturbing survey that was conducted by the B'nai B'rith Anti-Defamation League last year and this year that sort of asked people's reaction to 11 anti-Semitic statements, like, do you think this statement is true or false, in 100 countries, and the results were very, very disturbing. I mean, just to give you one example, they asked a sample of Americans, do you think the following statement is probably true? And the statement was, American Jews are more loyal to the state of Israel than to the United States of America. And I just ask you in your own head to guess how many respondents to this survey is to say, how many Americans, because it's a representative sample, would have said that this outlandish statement is probably true. It was 31%, almost a third of the country. So obviously racism and anti-Semitism are still very much with us, and this is just one reason of many why Holocaust education is so important, because it's a very helpful sort of weapon against prejudices of every kind. But I have to insist that there's just a crucial difference between now and 70, 80 years ago. In the workplace, at universities, and political life, you cannot openly state racist or anti-Semitic views. And this is by and large true across the world's 25 or so democracies, with partial exceptions here and there, and yes, the problem in political life of coded language sometimes. Nonetheless, it is far more difficult today, and in many countries sheerly impossible, to build a political program around racism, to build a political party around anti-Semitism. 80 years ago you could. Today you really can't. And that, I think, is an important change. And finally, maybe the most important, is that we in the world's democracies, we've just lost our interest in major warfare. It's true in this country we've done a lot of fighting in the last 2.5 decades, but it's one thing. It is one thing to attack a third world country like Iraq and lose 4,500 of our people, which to me was 4,500 far too many. It is another thing entirely to fight a war on the scale of World War II, where we lost 407,000. And if you scale that up to today's population, you're talking about 1.1 million fatalities. We will not accept that level of casualties. We're never going to fight another war like that anymore. The only way we could is if we were invaded, and that's a geographic impossibility. And as for the Germans and the Japanese, the aggressors of the Second World War, those people are pacifists. And I don't mean that, that's not hyperbole, it's the literal truth. So, and this is so crucial, because I would contend that without major war, without the context of a major war, it is probably not possible to perpetrate a genocide. War enables genocide in that it establishes a violent context in which the loss of so many of your own people makes you more willing to take the lives of people who you feel do not belong to your group. It creates a kind of polarizing sort of us versus them mentality. The world is divided into allies and into enemies, and that, you're very quick. People are vulnerable, they feel threatened, they're very quick to support harsh measures against any group that can be portrayed as an enemy. And governments become so much more powerful, which allows them to commit all kinds of violence. People surrender freedom in wartime to their government in military service or food rationing or what have you. And in wartime, governments become more powerful because everyone rallies around the flag, and if you criticize your government, you're automatically unpatriotic. In all these ways, a major war, and I don't mean a minor war, but I mean a really major war where the energies of a society are really engaged, is a terrible enabler of genocide. I think it's an essential precondition. And we in the world's democracies, we've closed the book on that. We're not going to fight another war like that again. And so we are, in that sense, safe from genocide. To someone who's living in sub-Saharan Africa or East Asia or parts of the Middle East, what I've just said is pretty cold comfort, because in those parts of the world there are peoples for whom genocide is part of their future. I don't want to deny the horror of that. But we in the world's democracies are beyond that. We're safe from it. We weren't 80 years ago. We are today. And this is moral progress. And I think it's very important that we acknowledge it, because if we wish to make further progress, if we wish to build a better and more decent world, we have to have some confidence in our ability to do so. And part of the way you acquire that confidence is by acknowledging, how far we've come. And we've come a very long way since the Second World War. So that's the second part of my argument. And yet, I can sort of talk all day to you with reasoned arguments. I can appeal to your faculty of reason in the way that I have tried to do so far. And yet, nonetheless, in your heart and in mine, there is still fear. And if we are going to understand really what the Holocaust says about us or does not say about us. We need to confront this fear. We need to understand where it comes from. We need to find a way to manage it and look past it if we are going to objectively consider this question, this question that is so important. And so for the last 12 minutes of my initial presentation, I'm going to address the question, why is it that we fear the Holocaust? Why does it scare us in a way that no other historical event does? I'm going to tell you a story. This is an incident that took place in Treblinka. We know about it from the journalist Gita Sereni, who conducted interviews in 1971 with a man named Franz Stangl. And Stangl had been the commanding officer, the commandant, at 2 death camps in German-occupied Poland, first at Sobibor, and then, starting in September 1942, at Treblinka. And in this capacity, he had presided over the murder by poison gas of roughly 500,000 human beings. Sereni asked him if there was any aspect of his time in these death camps that he had enjoyed, and he said with emphasis, human relations. And he met with Jewish prisoners. And indeed, he claimed to have had quite friendly relations with the prisoners in these camps. And you have to remember, who is he talking about? He is talking about, in each camp, a floating population of 400 or 500, mostly men, who are serving the Germans as slave labor. And they're there to help basically keep the machinery of death operating. A lot of these poor people have the job of dragging dead bodies from the gas chambers to where they're going to be burned. So they're in this terrible situation, and they're living constantly under threat of death. And as soon as they have outlived their usefulness, their lives are over. Their survival is not part of the German plan. And they understand this terrible reality every bit as well as Stangl did. And yet, his relations with them, his interactions with them, are friendly. What's up with that? What does this mean? How can this be? Well, Stangl gave us an example of his friendly human relations. It was his dealings with a prisoner named Blau from Vienna. And one day, Blau comes to Stangl's office. He stands at attention. He requests permission to speak, as he had to. He looked very worried. And it turned out that Blau's 80-year-old father had just come in on a train from Vienna. And his father was going to die in the gas chambers of Treblinka within the hour. And Stangl said, really, Blau, it's quite impossible. You misunderstand. A man of 80. By which he meant to say that Blau's father was, your father is too old to be any use to me as slave labor. I have no excuse to put off his death. He's got to die today. And Blau said, in effect, I understand this, but I don't want my father to die in a gas chamber. So with Stangl's permission, Blau took his father to the camp kitchen, served him a final meal, and then escorted him to the door of the so-called infirmary, which was a structure disguised as a medical facility by a large red cross painted on the side. And from that door led a long corridor into the interior of this space. We don't know what the son told his father in their last moments together, whether he told his father what was going to happen to him in the infirmary, or whether, and we know, there are a number of other prisoners who have been in similar situations with friends or relatives who've wanted to know what was going to happen to them. And judging from how they acted, I think there's good reason for thinking that the young Blau decided to spare his father the fear of death until the last possible moment, and said to him, look, you're going to go into the infirmary and they're going to give you some medical treatment and it's going to be fine. Something like that. We don't know for sure, but that's a good guess. So as he was escorted down this long corridor into the depths of the infirmary, the elder Blau may not have sensed that anything was amiss, but at the end, he rounded a corner and learned his fate. Assailing his nostrils is the stench of rotting human flesh, and before his eyes is a pit full of the bodies of people who've been murdered, and standing on the edge of the pit is a cold-hearted man in the black uniform of the SS. And this man said to him, come on, Jew, come forward, take off your clothes. stand there on this plank at the edge of the pit, and murdered him with a pistol shot to the back of the neck. Later that day, the younger Blau returned to Stengel's office. Herr Kommandant, I want to thank you. I took my father to the kitchen. I gave him a meal. I took him to the infirmary. It's all over. Thank you very much. Well, Blau, there's no need to thank me. But if you want to thank me, you may. What happened here? What happened here, in Stengel's eyes, was that he did Blau a favor by arranging to have Blau's father murdered by gunshot instead of by poison gas, and this favor counted as part of the human relations that he had enjoyed with prisoners, which tells you volumes about the extent to which he considered these prisoners human. His attitude was typical, and his actions were typical of very many of the murderers in the Holocaust. They subscribed to a racist ideology that held that the Jewish people were a kind of separate subhuman species. This is kind of sort of a result of the biological racism I was talking to you earlier when I was discussing the causes, that the Jews are less than human, and therefore to take a Jew's life is nothing about which you should feel guilt or shame or even tension or anxiety or even the slightest unease. Their attitude, and they lived among their victims in these camps, in case of some prisoners, for a period of years. And their attitude reminds us of nothing quite so much as the attitude of a farmer moving among livestock that he has decided to slaughter. And he doesn't hate his cows and his pigs. But he has to kill them. It's part of his job. And likewise for Stengel, murdering the Blau family and the other 500,000 people that he murdered as commandant of these camps was just a job. And my argument to you is that this way of thinking about and feeling about other human beings, or should I say more accurately, not feeling about other human beings, an attitude of killers toward victims that we see in no other episode of atrocity or genocide, that is unique to the Holocaust, goes to the heart of what makes the Holocaust so terrifying and so important to us. The Holocaust is so important and so scary because it's a unique moment in history where the best educated, most successful members of our most advanced society, really you'd say these people were the creme de la creme of human civilization by many standards, made a very firm and determined statement that human life has absolutely no inherent value whatsoever. I'll make this concrete with some examples. First, what's remarkable about the Holocaust, and you see this in no other episode of genocide, was the way that they denied their victims humanity by reducing them to the status of material objects that they process for value, like they were animal carcasses. As you know, you've heard, harvesting the teeth to melt out the gold fillings, shearing off women's hair to make textiles. Second, in, say, the Rwandan or the Armenian or the Cambodian genocides, the victims were murdered for an immediate practical purpose that had at least some rational quality to it. I'm not suggesting that the actions of the killers was in any way reasonable or justifiable, but these were motives we could understand. And in all three cases, the principal motive probably was to secure the killers' hold on political power, because their hold on power was very shaky and threatened in all three cases. In the Holocaust, there was no immediate practical purpose. I mean, they came up with justifications, but that's not why they were doing it. The victims were murdered because the very existence of the Jewish people was unacceptable to their killers. And so for the first time in history, we have come to murder millions of our fellow human beings for the sole purpose of taking their lives. Their death was an end in itself. And that brings me to the third and final kind of unique aspect of the Holocaust that I think supports my general argument about what makes the Holocaust uniquely frightening, namely that the Jews were the only large ethnic group in history to be targeted for complete biological extinction. The Germans hoped to murder not just all 11 Jews who by their calculations lived on the European continent. The hope was then defeat England, defeat the Soviet Union, have at Hitler's disposal all the resources and manpower of the European continent, and build a war machine so powerful that they could overcome the United States. And having done that, they'd be in a position to strike at every single remaining Jewish community around the world, no matter how small. They saw the Jewish people the way that public health organizations used to view smallpox. It's a virus, and we have to eradicate it. We have to stamp it out everywhere on earth so that it can never, ever grow back. And so my argument to you is that the Holocaust is so frightening because it forces us, it confronts us with the question of whether our own life has meaning and purpose and value, because the most educated members of our most advanced society chose to affirm on such a colossal scale and with such great determination that no, it does not. It has no such value. The Holocaust is in that sense an existential threat. And it is unique among historical occurrences because it is the event that far more than any other confronts us with these existential questions. Having said all this, I'm not sure that I've made the Holocaust any less frightening to you. In some ways, the more I studied this, the more I came to ponder this and recognize what this really meant. In some ways, the more frightening it has become. And yet, nonetheless, I do think that I hope to have clarified or to have given a reasonable explanation for kind of the visceral sort of reaction of fear that I think so many of us have when we contemplate the Holocaust, and that it will allow us to look at the matter a little bit more objectively and to better understand what it means and what it says and doesn't say about us. You know, I became a historian to confront the existential challenges of the Holocaust. That is, this declaration, this statement by the killers that human life, including my life, has no value whatsoever. And obviously, this aspect of the Holocaust has struck me far more powerfully than it has almost everyone else who's looked at it, because I've built my whole life around kind of trying to figure it out. And I've often wondered, you know, why me? What's been different about me? You know, unfortunately, part of the answer is that I am, for want of a better word, weird. And I mean, nothing that should alarm you, but if you want to buy a copy of my book, you can approach it and I'll sign it for you, and you know, I'm harmless. But there's a more interesting answer to that question, and it's very germane, and that is that I've never believed in God. I've never had any religious instruction. You know, if you believe in God, if you really believe, these existential questions, the worth of my existence, the meaning of my existence, these are not terribly scary questions. You know, your life has value because you're made in God's image. Your life has purpose, meaning, because God put you here on the planet for a reason. But if you're like me, and you don't have any faith at all, you're not made in the image of God. You're just a glorified monkey, and you face these questions alone. And for me, the only answer that I've ever been able to come to that's ever allowed me to sort of face the kind of the terror of this is to embrace a kind of stance of unconditional love for all humanity, which in a way you can say is kind of a post-Christian sort of approach. I mean, it's in a way sort of the secular equivalent of what we have, I think, in the Sermon on, where is it? I think the Sermon on the Mount, but in any case, that you must love your neighbor as you love yourself, and that you must love your enemies, which, if you love your enemies, that basically means loving everyone. And, you know, it's a kind of leap of faith for me, in the same way that for many, choosing to believe in God is a leap of faith. I chose to believe in people. And so the way this works for me is that my life has value because I'm human, and all human life has value. And my life has meaning because every human life means something. And I'm worthy of love because all human beings are lovable. And the Holocaust, nothing challenges this philosophical stance more dramatically than does the Holocaust. And Elie Wiesel, the Auschwitz survivor and Nobel laureate, put his finger on why. He said, the opposite of love is not hatred. The opposite of love is indifference. And you see this indifference in the way that Franz Stangl treated the Blau family in Treblinka. He didn't hate the Blaus, but he cared so little about them that murdering them was just a job to him and caused him no discomfort and did not disturb in any way his positive opinion of himself. And when he arranged for the older Blau to be murdered by gunshot instead of poison gas, this didn't make him a murderer in his own eyes. It made him a nice guy. People ask me so often, why did they hate the Jews so much? People assume, and it's a very reasonable assumption to make, that the Holocaust had to have been driven, fueled, motivated by an especially passionate kind of hatred. And to that I say we should be so lucky. We should be so lucky. Hatred is a relationship among human beings who acknowledge, at least to some degree, each other's humanity. We care about people we hate. They're important to us. And yes, in the Holocaust, all the killers to some degree hated their Jewish victims, if only because the Jewish victims made them be there in this unpleasant place doing an unpleasant job. But hatred was not the predominant motivation for this genocide. What made the Holocaust, what set it apart from all other historical events, is that the signal, the characteristic mental state of the Holocaust perpetrator was not hot, passionate hatred. It was an indifference so cold that mass murder inspired in these men and some women no emotion more powerful than the disgust that you feel when you step on a cockroach in your kitchen. So if you're like me and you try to make sense of the world through love for humanity, this is kind of the most devastating challenge to it. So I had to know how this could happen, and I had to know what this says about us. I'll start with what it does not say about us. Holocaust doesn't say that human beings, it doesn't prove that human beings are evil. What do I mean by that? I mean, if you're evil, you deliberately do something that you know is wrong, and you're happy to do something that's wrong. Maybe you even do it especially because it is wrong. You know from your experience, there are very few people like that. Yes, there are people in your life who will hurt you, and there are people who will treat you unethically and who will cheat you or steal from you. But even these people have a way of telling themselves that what they did was morally right. They have rationalizations. They need to justify their conduct if they're going to look themselves in the mirror. The only people who don't need to do that are sociopaths, and that's a pretty small minority. Like us, almost all human beings need to see themselves as morally upright, as decent, and as kind. And the murderers in the Holocaust, the perpetrators, did not differ from us at all in this regard. The problem comes, it's kind of the small print in this whole story, is how do you define what's moral? Because there's no universal definition. And the weakness that we all have is we have no moral compass. We have no internal gyroscope that will keep us morally on the straight and narrow, no matter how our circumstances change, no matter what the people around us are doing. And so when our circumstances change, we redefine, we sort of rewrite our moral code. We redefine right and wrong. We defer unthinkingly to authority figures who tell us to do things that even 5 minutes ago we thought were wrong. We conform to the behavior of the people around us who we want to accept us and like us, even though they're doing something that once we might have considered depraved. We accept whatever new role we have been assigned by circumstance or by the people above us, and we adopt whatever set of moral values is consistent with that role. And so the Holocaust does demonstrate that if you teach us the wrong ideas, and if you put us under control of the wrong government, and if you place us in the wrong circumstances, we are capable of doing absolutely anything, no matter how depraved. But I insist that the most important word in this sentence is if. And since the Second World War and the world's democracies, and we're talking now by today's count perhaps 25 countries with 800 million people, we've been teaching ourselves the right ideas. We've been building the right kind of government, which is democracy. We've by and large avoided, in our country's history, the Vietnam War is the most tragic exception. We've avoided the circumstances that encourage us to be cruel. And so we have built societies that are morally superior to every human society that came before. And this is moral progress. So in closing, there are two things that I want for you, two things that I want you to get from reading my book. First, I hope and I expect that when you're done reading it, you will feel confident that you understand how this could happen, that the Holocaust will no longer be a mystery to you. And second, I want you to see the Holocaust, to see it in what I think is the proper perspective. On the one hand, yes, is quite possibly the most depraved thing we've ever done, and thus as a warning to us and something that not only should we remember, but that we should keep vivid and alive in our memory. But on the other hand, no, not as our destiny, and never as an excuse for pessimism about the future of humanity. Thank you very much.